Hello, welcome to the ELEX webinar, Budget Transparency in Collection Development. I'm Holly Tomrin, a member of the ELEX Continuing Education Committee. I will be your host for today's webinar. Our presenters today are Mary Gilbert and Deborah A. Nolan. Mary is Assistant University Librarian for Content Management and is on the library's management team at Towson University in Maryland. Her responsibilities include management of the collection budget, acquisitions of books, serials, and e-resources, cataloging and government documents, liaison and instruction, and management of the Technical Services Department. Previously, she worked at Howard Community College, Maryland, and the University of Texas at Austin. She earned her MLS from the University of Rhode Island. Deborah is Dean of University Libraries at Towson University. Her career includes librarian and library administrative roles in public schools, community colleges, and private and public universities. She has provided consulting in the areas of strategic planning, human resources management, and space utilization. Dr. Nolan has been active in professional associations including ALA and ACRL. She earned her MLS at the University of Pittsburgh and an EDD in instructional technology. There are a few things to keep in mind for today's presentation. All attendees are muted. If you have questions for Mary and Deborah, please type them into the question box on your screen and they will answer them at the end of the presentation. Our software does not have interactive chat capabilities. You may use the ELEX hashtag if you wish to use Twitter to comment on today's presentation. The hashtag is ALCTSCE. We do not monitor the Twitter feed, so please use the question box to submit questions and comments. This webinar is being recorded and you will receive an email with links to the recording and presentation slides. And now here's Deborah. There will be a slight delay as we change presenters.
Hello. Welcome to our presentation, Budget Transparency in Collection Development. This webinar emerged from several presentations that Mary and I led on the complexities of collection development decision-making and the importance of being transparent about the funding and the cost issues as well as the decision-making processes. By way of background, we first conducted this workshop over a 2-day period, 2 half-day sessions for our university librarians. We had had some significant changes in staffing in the library, and we saw a need to help everybody understand the budget process for collection development. When we conducted this workshop, these 2 half-day workshops for our librarians, the purpose was to give them a better understanding of the multiple sources of funding for our collections, our typical spending patterns, and the decision-making dilemmas that we face every year. A key component of the workshop was a set of real-life scenarios for the librarians to discuss and also develop possible solutions. We wanted the librarians to experience some of the actual decision-making dilemmas that we face every year. We then transformed the 2-part workshop into a 45-minute presentation for librarians at the Charleston Conference in 2015. At the Charleston Conference, we also used the scenario problem-solving techniques, and it provided the attendees with an opportunity, again, to examine real-life collection development dilemmas and crowdsource solutions. As a result of that presentation, a publisher asked us to come and do the presentation for publishers at the 2016 Society for Scholarly Publishing Conference. Now, this was very interesting because we were able to give publishers an inside view of what libraries experience when libraries are trying to balance requests and needs with the high cost of resources. This year, our library actually faced a very troubling budget situation that required some very difficult decisions. We recognized the need to provide our constituents, meaning librarians, faculty, staff, administrators with an in-depth look at our collection budget and collection costs so that everyone could better understand why we had to make some very unpopular decisions. Drawing from our presentations, we shared key elements with our academic deans, department chairs, and representatives to the library advisory committee, which is made up of faculty and students. I'm giving you this background so as to set the scene for today's webinar. The goal of our presentation is to share our experience and approach to managing a precarious collections budget shortfall in a transparent manner that educates, engages, and informs a broad constituent audience. As collection budgets remain flat, are reduced, or see minimal growth, decision-making is increasingly complex. Communicating with stakeholders about the issues and inviting constituent feedback on both proposed solutions and the issues are key to transparency. We have found that transparency includes sharing collection data, describing pricing models, and explaining institutional budget realities. For our presentation, we do offer this caveat. Libraries have differing realities. Could be funding sources, budget parameters, political backdrops, etc. All of these affect collection budget management. Our examples are based on an academic library. However, we do hope our examples will help generate ideas for you to use in approaching difficult budgetary situations in your library, regardless of the library type. So the primary purpose of being transparent about collection funding and costs is to educate your constituents. Steps to transparency include identifying your constituents, clarifying the budget realities for your library, communicating the issues and the processes involved in budget decision-making, exploring strategies for making those tough decisions and explaining those strategies to your constituents, and providing mechanisms for feedback, both from the constituents to the library and from the library to your constituents. Keep in mind, as we learned, that no matter how much and how often you communicate, people will be shocked and dismayed about funding, costs, and possible remedies. So first you need to identify your constituents, and they will depend on the type of library you are in. Could be faculty, students, members of the general community, your administration, and this is beyond the library administration, your board of governors, your board of trustees, and possible officials. Yes. Welcome to reality. For every constituent group, you need to communicate the budget realities and complexities the library faces. That is, the realities that are critical to understanding the library's purchasing power and the realities that include spending patterns and cost factors, as well as funding sources and allocations. So welcome to reality may be a good title for your presentation to your constituents.
Okay, first, in order to clarify these budget realities, we need to first talk about a typical academic library spending pattern. So while library spending patterns do vary by the type of library, in most academic libraries, between 70 and 90% of the collection budget will go to fund e-resources. And these are e-resources such as databases, e-journals, e-books, and to some extent, streaming video. And this spending pattern has continued to escalate, with many libraries having to work very hard to prevent e-resources from consuming their entire collections budget. An important part of being financially transparent consists of educating constituents about the factors that drive collection costs for the library. Most constituents are not aware or don't really understand the many factors that can affect the cost of e-resources. So these explanations become very important. For example, the most common pricing model for databases is based on FTE, or full-time equivalency enrollment. For a large academic institution, this pricing model is one of the major reasons for high database prices, explaining that two universities could pay a significantly different price for the same database with the same content solely because of their differing FTE enrollment often comes as a shock to faculty. In addition, purchasing large journal bundles versus purchasing on a title-by-title basis can be very expensive, with many bundles containing both subscribed and what I like to call access titles that are included as part of the journal package. One of the things we discovered while reviewing our journals for possible cancellation was that this bundle pricing model can be surprisingly hard to break apart, especially when you have strong usage statistics for the added non-subscribed titles that are included in the package. Furthermore, many constituents think that e-journals are somehow less expensive than print, so explaining that any price reduction based on format will be minimal and in some cases will actually cost more is often a revelation. The journal inflation rate in terms of what it means to the library is also a surprise. And by showing real figures that demonstrate what inflation means for $1 million journal list, even without making any changes, can be eye-opening. Since most faculty members have no idea how much e-resources actually cost, the library decided as part of this cancellation project to demonstrate these costs by providing specific examples for different kinds of e-resources. So for example, in what you see on our screen, a database with streaming video, $19,000 every year. A database with full-text journals, $25,000 every year. A database with e-books, $50,000 every year. And a bundled journal package, $150,000 every year. And the reason I emphasize the every year is because I had had more than one faculty member say to me, "What, you mean this isn't a one-time price? You have to pay this every year?" So seeing how much an e-resource can cost is often astonishing, and I've had more than one faculty member comment to me that she didn't understand why everything was so expensive and why e-journals should be so expensive. She thought they should be less expensive, and wasn't that one of the main points of going electronic?
So, the other side of the reality is the source of funds. As indicated earlier in our presentation, funding support to libraries will vary from institution to institution and by agency type. In the academic setting, even comparably sized universities vary in funding support to their libraries for many reasons, which would be an entirely different webinar. We won't get into that at this point. Our library supports a public comprehensive university enrolling about 23,000 students with a full-time equivalency enrollment of 19,000 students. The budget examples that we're using in this particular presentation are not our actual budget figures, but they are representative of the funding proportions and expenditure situations that we face. So our collection funds here come from three categories: the university allocation, from fines and fees that are collected each year, and from endowment income. Our fines and fees vary from year to year and they're very unpredictable. The funds for our institution are transferred into our collection budget, but that doesn't happen at all institutions. Our endowment income is very small because we have very few endowed funds, and those funds in themselves are small, generating a limited amount of income each year. Some libraries have a much greater endowment for their collections. Overall, for our situation, our total collection funds, i.e. those funds available to spend on collections, comes to about $2,125,000. Our collection expenditures fall into two major categories. First, collections, materials, and second, access to and support for collections. Constituents usually understand what makes up collections, journals, databases, books, and so on, and in our case we spend about $2,285,000 on collections. Very few constituents, however, realize that the cost for providing access to collections, that is the behind-the-scenes costs of cataloging, document delivery, copyright fees, and so on, that's a part of our collection expenditure as well. To support our collection activities and our collection access, we spend about $115,000 on these invisible costs each year. So our total collections related expenditures comes to about $2,400,000. So just do the math. Our funding at $2,125,000, our expenditures at $2,400,000, that creates a shortfall of $275,000. Now that's a reality check. So what do you think? It'd be great to overspend the budget, but no, I know at my institution that is not a viable solution.
So, what are our next steps? The big question was what to do about the deficit. So our first step in answering this question was to explore and illustrate to our constituents practical and realistic strategies to deal with the deficit. And if we assume that overspending the budget isn't really a viable alternative, we have basically three options. We can increase funding, we can reallocate the funds that we already have, or we can reduce expenditures, or perhaps we can do a combination of all three. So let's look first at increasing funding. Increasing funding, however, is easier said than done. Convincing your institution or governing body to increase the library's budget isn't an easy sell in today's economic climate, and in many cases it's really not realistic. Some other options include developing a marketing plan to cultivate donors, or applying for grants either directly or as part of sponsored research with the university. All of these, however, are time-consuming activities with no guarantees as to their success. One possibility libraries that actually emerged with this cancellation project was to include departments in the funding process by showing how they can actually contribute to purchase a specific database or e-journal. And many departments had never considered this possibility until we pointed it out to them. And actually this works very well for discipline-specific databases or e-journals, such as what you see on your screen with our nursing department, specific journals that are targeted for that discipline. Reallocating funds within the budget is often mentioned as a quick, easy way to manage a budget shortfall. In other words, simply shift your funds around to cover the expenses. Libraries need to explain to their constituents the inherent limitations of this method, that while this may work for a one-time shortfall, It isn't an effective method to manage an ongoing deficit caused by inflation and a static budget. While often suggested as an easy answer, the library should clarify that basically when you do this, you are robbing Peter to pay Paul. And at some point, usually sooner rather than later, this method becomes ineffectual. Unfortunately, there are no easy answers, and the library needs to be clear about this with their constituents. So, on a practical note, reducing collection expenditures is the most effective and often the only viable way to manage a significant and ongoing budget deficit. This method needs to be clearly explained and justified to constituents, since of all the approaches, this will be the least popular and the one most likely to cause conflict and hard feelings. If the deficit was caused by a one-time shortfall, then one possibility for an academic library might be to simply not buy books for a year. And in fact, this was a suggestion we received by more than one faculty member. And while this method has some appeal with faculty, given their reliance on e-resources, there are two problems with this approach. First, and this is probably the most relevant, given the percentage of the budget that goes to e-resources, stopping all book purchases would not, in many cases, and certainly not in our case, be enough to cover the deficit. And secondly, this method is unfair to heavily book-dependent disciplines such as English and history. And of course, for public libraries, this wouldn't be a viable solution. As we noted earlier in our presentation, the majority of collection expenditures goes to fund e-resources. Therefore, in most cases, if there is a significant ongoing budget deficit, databases and journals are the only parts of the budget with enough funds to make a significant impact on expenditure reductions. And this needs to be clearly explained, clearly and concisely to your constituents, so there's no possible misunderstanding or false expectations.
So let's talk a little bit more about expenditure reduction. We have some examples we're going to share with you, and we are going to point out that each of these examples, each of these strategies has advantages and disadvantages. For many years, we've actually told our faculty that in order to buy a journal, you need to cancel a journal from your discipline of like value. This strategy has been used for probably 10 years. It has provided cost containment. However, it's very difficult for smaller departments that only have a few journals in their disciplines. Some libraries have relied on aggregator databases for full-text journals. This is something that we have avoided for many years, but finally came to grips with it this year, and we'll tell you a little more about that in a few minutes. By relying on aggregator databases for access to journal articles, you have access at lower cost. Often journals are available through several aggregator databases, so it provides multiple access points. However, you have to deal with embargoes, and sometimes a database may embargo a journal for up to 7 years. Also, aggregated databases cannot guarantee that a particular journal will remain in its collection. This instability of holdings is really dependent on publisher and database negotiations. Finally, databases provide access to articles only, not to full entire journals cover to cover. So you miss out on the table of contents, you miss out on advertisements, which are sometimes really important to marketing classes, for example. Another example for reducing expenditures is to try new purchasing models, and I think a lot of us have done this. Patron-driven acquisitions, demand-driven acquisitions, and so on. This kind of model will provide extensive content at a minimal cost, partly because expenditure is based on use. So there's minimal waste. You're not spending money on something that people are not actually using. There's also some flexibility in payment. You can pay as you go along, or you can pay up front and draw down from a deposit account. There are drawbacks, however. The library's profile must be very accurate. An inaccurate or incomplete profile will result in unplanned expenses. In addition, this type of model requires careful monitoring to avoid overexpenditure or reliance on dead links to content. With an emphasis on access over ownership, it's very easy to immediately jump to relying more heavily on interlibrary loan. It's certainly cost-effective, but there are a couple of downsides that immediately come to mind. One, students won't wait to receive something on interlibrary loan. They'd rather go to something that's immediately available online, even if it's an older article. Number two, faculty often resist interlibrary loan, even though we reassure them that interlibrary loan resources can be delivered in less than 24 hours. Finally, for this presentation, another expenditure reduction example is the Comprehensive Journal Cancellation Project. By doing a comprehensive journal cancellation project, there are several benefits. One is it provides an opportunity to fully review the relevance of all your subscriptions. It encourages constituent participation in the review and in the decision-making process. It's also a way to truly educate your faculty about the high cost of journals. On the other hand, faculty members have a visceral response to simply hearing you utter the words journal cancellation. Journal cancellations have a negative impact on the library's public relations with the faculty and with other constituents. Faculty members protest that cancellations will affect their scholarship, recruitment of new faculty, and the reputation of their department and the institution. As many of you I know have experienced, journal cancellation decisions create conflict. Also, these projects are very complex and time-consuming, and they are iterative. Sometimes you have to do these kinds of projects every few years. So, what are we going to do? All the examples that we've provided for reducing expenditures will help. However, the biggest bang for the buck is indeed the journal cancellation project.
So, as the first step in our ongoing efforts with fiscal transparency, we shared with our constituents the criteria that we use to determine the initial journal cancellation list. We emphasized on the cancellation website and also in meetings and emails that the principles used for cancellation would be based on access versus ownership. In other words, we didn't have to own everything if we could provide access in a reasonable amount of time. We further explained that we made no attempt to cancel by discipline, but rather we canceled by categories. And this explanation addressed a concern expressed by several faculty members who felt that some departments, usually theirs, had suffered more cancellations than others. On a practical note, however, balancing cancellations by department or discipline really wasn't feasible, and it actually wasn't fair. We also listed the basic questions we asked about each title to determine the initial cancellation list, all of which were based on our basic principle, access instead of ownership. And these questions, which you see on our screen, were, is the journal in a library-subscribed JSTOR package? Is the journal in a library-subscribed aggregator database? Are these databases with or without embargoes? And if not in JSTOR or another database, is the cost per use, or CPU, $100 or greater? So this chart shows the different categories that we use to consider for our cancellation list and the approximate amounts that could be saved in each category. So for example, if you look at the first category, if a subscribed title was also available in our JSTOR subscription with a 7-year embargo or less, the journal was put on the cancellation list. And this had a potential savings of $117,700. If a subscribed journal was available in a subscribed database without an embargo, the journal went on the cancellation list. And the potential savings here was $7,000, which was actually the smallest amount in all the categories. If a subscribed journal was available in a subscribed database with embargoes, the journal went on the cancellation list. Potential savings, $92,000. If a print journal, and we still did have some print journals left, was available in a subscribed database with or without an embargo, the journal went on the cancellation list. And the potential savings here was $15,900. And finally, if the journal would have no e-access after cancellation and the cost per use was $100 or more, the journal went on the cancellation list. So the potential savings using all of these categories was $255,873. So after determining our initial list, our initial potential cancellations, which we based on the above categories and criteria, the widest communication possible was our most important priority. So first we sent an initial email to deans, chairs, department representatives, librarians, and the Library Advisory Committee, explaining the reasons for the cancellation project, describing our decision-making criteria, outlining the steps in the process, and requesting feedback. And on screen in the yellow block, you will see an excerpt of the first email that we sent about the proposed cancellations. And in this email, as you'll see, we were very clear to show what our target goal was, which was approximately $300,000 in journal reductions. One interesting side note that came up, even though for the past year we had communicated widely to all different groups in the university community about the projected deficit and the ramifications, it wasn't until this email went out that we got any reaction to the proposed cancellations. And all we can think is that it just didn't seem real until people actually saw the list. So providing a cancellation website was also a high priority, and it was a critical component for budget transparency. So on this website, we included the following. We included a detailed explanation of the budget issues that we were facing, including the steps that the library had already taken to meet these budget problems. And this is very important to describe these steps to basically show that the library has exhausted or considered all possibilities before going to journal cancellations. Next, we gave a definition of terminology that most people wouldn't be familiar with, such as CPU or cost per use, FTE or full-time equivalency enrollment, and what is actually meant by an embargoed journal. Finally, we posted an email link for users to comment on each proposed cancellation. We placed a link to the cancellation website prominently on the front page of the library, and that's the blue box that you see on your screen. And we also included this link in the initial email we sent to the university community. Again, in order to continue to provide as complete budget transparency as possible, we listed all titles that we proposed for cancellation on the website. First, we had the title in the first column. In the second column, next to each title, was listed the e-access that would remain should we cancel the journal subscription. For example, available via JSTOR, in aggregator databases, etc. If no e-access would remain after cancellation, we explained why the title was still chosen for cancellation, such as the cost per use is $150 every time someone uses the journal. It's used so slightly. A link for email comments was the third column, and these emails came to me with a copy to the website administrator. One problem that emerged, not everyone understood what we meant by the column access retained. So when responding to comments that we received, we did attempt to remedy this problem with fuller and more complete explanations. So what were our final decision-making factors? First, the library considered all faculty feedback when making final decisions. And this step is very important. If you ask for feedback, then the comments or objections received must be taken seriously. Asking for feedback shouldn't be regarded strictly as pro forma and not really to be looked at seriously. So when making our final decisions, in addition to faculty feedback, we also considered aggregator database access, usage statistics, accreditation requirements, new program support, and program growth or decline. And all of these entered into our final review. These factors, of course, will vary depending on the kind of library. Of the almost 500 journals on the initial list, the library received comments on 94 titles, although some titles did receive multiple comments. The first email, which is in the beige bar, gives an example of a typical faculty comment. Please do not cancel. This is the seminal and most important journal in our discipline. The comments that we received from faculty varied, with some faculty going into detailed explanations about why we shouldn't cancel a title, and others simply saying, please don't cancel. The library responded by email to each comment received from faculty, and in a few cases, students. So this was up on our website, and this was also available for students to comment too. If you see the yellow bar, this shows you an excerpt of our initial response to a comment. This response included a fuller explanation about the reasons for the proposed cancellation, the actual price of the journal, the e-access retained after cancellation, and the cost per use if relevant. Adding the actual cost of the journal, which we actually did at the last minute, turned out to be a very good idea, since the cost was often a revelation. And I did receive several emails from faculty responding, wow, that's really expensive. I had no idea. And after reviewing all faculty responses and further evaluation of the titles, the library decided not to cancel 21 titles that had been on the original list. So each faculty member who had commented then received an email notifying them that the title they commented upon would not be canceled. And if you look at the green bar, you'll see an excerpt of the email that we sent to a faculty member explaining why that we weren't actually going to cancel this title. And just as an added note, the final number of journal subscriptions that we did cancel was 482.
So that gives you a lot of background, a lot of information about the process we used. One of the key factors or key activities that we did that I mentioned right at the beginning of our webinar was involving our constituents in looking at the problems. In our workshop for the librarians and in our presentations to librarians and publishers, we engage the audiences in discussing and then offering solutions to real-life collection budget situations. Through this crowdsourcing activity, participants experienced, albeit briefly, the dilemmas that we face every year as we work to balance collection needs with budget constraints. We divided our groups for all of the presentations that we did into 4 scenarios. I'm going to describe for you the scenarios that we used, and again, this would be a great way for you to tailor scenarios for your particular library situation. We gave critical thinking prompts to stimulate discussions for each scenario, and after the groups pondered the scenarios, they shared their thoughts, including additional factors to consider and potential solutions. The scenario technique effectively engaged the participants and was evaluated by participants as a strong educational experience. So for scenario 1, we asked the small group to view the problem from the library's perspective. The problem was faculty are requesting the library to purchase a new e-resources, in particular, a new database. Our prompt was for the group to consider the following issues. The title is critical for the program, based on the faculty members' comments. It was heavily used in trial, and it had good reviews. However, collection funds have already been spent or encumbered for the year. We've already canceled the low-use databases, so the question is, where will the money come from, and are there other options to satisfy the faculty request? The group was asked to think about what can be done. Scenario 2 also asked the participants to view the problem from the library's perspective. This problem was facing the escalating costs of journal bundles or packages. Issues to consider focused on both the characteristics and the costs of journal bundles. On the plus side, bundles often provide access to added titles. In other words, journals that come free, so to speak, with the bundle. Often bundles cost less than buying each title separately. However, would it be more cost-effective to buy only specific titles? Does the library really need those additional access titles? Are the additional access titles used? And if so, how does that affect your decision? What should the library do? In scenario 3, the participant group took the perspective of faculty. The problem was that faculty were told journal subscriptions will be canceled. The issues that they needed to consider included accessing the most current content. And in other words, if a subscription is canceled, how will I have access to the most current articles in my field? Is the journal necessary and valuable for teaching and scholarship in the discipline? Is it important to the credibility of the department for that discipline? And from the faculty perspective, interlibrary loan is insufficient. How would this problem be solved? In our 4th scenario, we asked the participants to look at the collection budget situation from the perspective of an administrator outside of the library. Librarians and library staff may find this perspective to be the most difficult to experience. The problem that collection costs, specifically journal subscriptions and database licenses, are unsustainable and institutional budgets are flat. So the key issues to consider in this scenario are competing institutional priorities for funding, a mistaken perception that the library budget is fungible, or that the library is the black hole that can never be filled or satisfied. Another key issue is faculty protest. The collections are necessary to support teaching and scholarship, and the collections are key issues in recruiting new faculty. Also, to consider, often administrators view consortial memberships as great opportunities, but they may not understand the challenges, complexities, and obstacles to actually sharing resources. So how can this administrative perspective be addressed?
So what comes next? This screen shows some possible future directions and considerations for collection development decision making, such as institutional repositories and their roles, the last copy, consortia collection development, which has been discussed somewhat in our institution, open access, and finally, ongoing journal review is also in the future. While nobody likes to deliver bad news, and while we don't expect or hope that future cancellations would be so extensive, it is the library's responsibility to be upfront and frank about budget realities. We did make it clear to our constituents that a static budget and continued inflation would necessitate ongoing journal review and future cancellations. In other words, this cancellation project was not a one-shot deal. So these are all questions to consider as we look to the future in collection development, and all merit consideration as future topics when providing transparency in collection decision making. So thank you. This concludes our presentation, and we do thank you for attending. We have about 10 minutes or so for questions, and also if we run out of time, Debbie and my emails are on the screen, and we'd be very happy to respond to you to any email. So, and just as an aside, the picture on the screen is a picture of our very busy library with all of our students at work. I think it was taken shortly before finals.
Thank you, Mary and Deborah, for your interesting presentation and your helpful ideas. If you have any questions from the audience, please go ahead and submit those in the question box. We do have some questions already. The first question is, if you work for an institution that has historically not been transparent about its budget, either inside or outside the library, do you have suggestions for how to change the culture so that transparency is valued more highly?
Yes, this is Debbie, and I would say you just have to jump in with both feet and do it. Your institution may not be transparent, but I think it is an example of good leadership and management for the library dean or director to be transparent about the library budget with all the constituents, really starting internally, starting with your library staff. Once you, and it is difficult, but once you do it, once you jump in and do it, I believe there's a sense of relief among all the library employees in understanding where money's coming from, why money is not coming to the library, and how the money is spent. I also think the transparency to your constituents, your faculty, for example, is key. As we explained, there are so many misconceptions and misunderstandings about the library budget. And over the past, say, 7 to 10 years, it's become more and more important to share this information. Years ago, the libraries, many of us, had plenty of money. We could buy books, we could subscribe to journals, but the budget situation everywhere is tighter and tighter and tighter, which to me means transparency is even more and more important.
And also, could I add something? This is Mary. One of the things that I discovered when we were doing this budget cancellation is even though we thought we had been being transparent for a long time, it turns out that there was so much that people, faculty members, didn't know, and that was really revealed to me with the surprise questions I received, and also the astonishment that people would, how they responded when I told them, well, how much this journal cost, that it cost $1,500 and only had 2 uses. And so that it was actually a big help for us when we were having to make these kinds of decisions.
Just one more point on the transparency. Because our upper level administration had already, we've already been faced with institutional budget constraints, and I had communicated to my provost that we were going to have to go through a journal cancellation project. He was very much in favor and supportive of the transparency and the approach that we took to sharing this information. He saw it as benefiting the higher level administration as well, because faculty would understand more in depth the budget situation for the library.
Great, thank you so much. We have another question. Would local public libraries' e-resources be considered when deciding which journals to be canceled?
That's a great question, and we have not done that, although we have a great relationship and partnership with our local county public library system. The problem, though, is that e-resources are licensed based on audience. So we cannot even share our e-resources remotely with other universities in our university system. If people from outside our university campus come to our library physically, they can certainly access e-resources from our computers. However, students, faculty from other universities in our system cannot access our e-resources remotely. This is another area of misunderstanding that needs to be, I think, very clear, whether it's a public library, a university library partnership, or a university system. When you talk about remote access to e-resources, it's very easy for people to think they can access e-resources from any library, from any location, and it's not true.
Thank you. Another question is, have you done any fundraising?
Actually, yes, and in fact, we are doing much more fundraising than we have in the past for several reasons. And we have been receiving some donations, some one-time, and some donations that will be ongoing, specifically for collections and for innovation in our library. We would like to do a lot more. We now have a librarian who works on grant proposals and advancement and development half-time. We would love to have a full-time fundraiser. but our institution does not provide a full-time development officer for the library. I know some other libraries do have that, which is great. We don't have that. We don't have that advantage, unfortunately.
Okay, we have time for one more question. An audience member asks, how will you address next year's shortfall?
Well, as we said, and this was one of the things that I do think is really important, is to make very clear to everyone about the ongoing nature of this. So when we start to look at our next year's journal list, one of the things that we'll be looking at are actually some of our journal bundles that we didn't actually address in this year's cancellation project. And as we said earlier in the presentation, it was somewhat of a surprise to me when I really started looking at this, how difficult it actually was to break up some of these journal packages. So difficult, and because I was so limited in time, that for some of these I just put aside for the moment. So I think next year this is going to be an area that we'll look at much closer. And again, we will let everyone know as soon as we possibly can what we're going to be doing so that there aren't any surprises.
I will add to that we already received our notification of what our budget will be, our university allocation will be next year for FY18, and it is going to be the same as it is this year, with the potential of maybe another $40,000, but I'm still negotiating that. Nonetheless, inflation is going to make our purchasing power the same or less than it is this year. So that's a great question. Check back with us next year. We'll let you know.
Okay, that was our last question. Thank you again, Mary and Debbie.
You're welcome.
We're glad that you could be with us today. You'll soon receive an email with a link to the recording, slides, and a short online evaluation form. So please take a few minutes to complete the evaluation. We value your comments, and they help the ELEC's Continuing Education Committee plan future events. The email will also include a certificate of attendance and information on how to get a digital badge. Thanks to Wanda Jaziere and Iping Chen Gaffey from the ELEC's Continuing Education Committee and Megan Doherty from the ELEC's office for technical support. The support they provide makes it possible for us to present these webinars smoothly. We have one more webinar this fall on the topic of research data management. We also have additional webinars being scheduled for spring, including a 5-part series on re-envisioning technical services based on the successful 2016 Midwinter Symposium held in Boston. So details and dates will be available on the ELEC's website soon. We also offer web courses, which are 4 to 6 weeks long, and e-forums, which are 2-day email discussions. You'll find more information on the ELEC's website. We hope you will participate in other ELEC's continuing education offerings again in the future. This concludes our session. Thank you for joining us.